All right, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Samuel Moyn, and he is publishing a book in about 3 weeks. The publication date will be September 7th, 2021. The title of the book is Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. And this is not his first book. He's actually published 5 other books, but he's also the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and a Professor of History at Yale University. The other books that he's written is A Holocaust Controversy, The Treblinka Affair in Post-War France, published 2005. Origins of the Other, Emmanuel Levinas, Between Revelation and Ethics, published 2007. The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, published 2012. Human Rights and the Uses of History, published 2014. And then in 2019, Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World. But this book traces the pattern of this idea of being more humane in these vicious conflicts. But it goes back, but it was interesting, this book, it started with the figure, very fascinating figure of Leon Tolstoy, and kind of followed it all the way up into the present, but he can talk more about that. So Samuel Moyn, are you there?
I am. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. So for people, if you want to add anything to your lengthy academic background or your books, please do, and tell the audience what led you to write this very timely book, Humane.
Well, I worked in government under Bill Clinton in the National Security Council in my youth. But really, like the rest of us, I've just been reflecting on the war on terror, now coming up on 20 years old. The first intervention was in Afghanistan, now ending, with a lot of hullabaloo around how quickly the Taliban took over. I really wrote this book in response to Barack Obama's presidency, because it was then that America figured out how to fight a sustainable war on terror. Actually, we've been pulling down troops in Afghanistan since Obama tried the surge, remember, that brought our troops up to 100,000. By the time Donald Trump was president, there were only a few thousand. So it's true that Joe Biden pulling out is making a big difference in the sense that the Taliban is conquering the whole place. But it's been a long time that we've been changing our American war towards this more humane form of war that I target in this book. And it's a form of war that will outlast what's happening in Afghanistan today.
Right. So like you've seen this change, and you really go back and start the book off with, and I was surprised about all the pacifism, the transnational relationships between pacifistic individuals and organizations. But you start with a really important figure, Leo Tolstoy. Can you talk about him and his importance to what's led up to the present?
Absolutely. So, the reason I start back in the 19th century is it's because it's then in the middle, around the 1850s and 60s, that people first start to think that we could make war humane. And the big argument of my book is that that's only really happened in the past few decades. And yet from the beginning in the 19th century, this novelist, Leo Tolstoy, famous as the author of maybe the greatest novel of modern times, War and Peace, he worried about the whole idea of making war humane. He did early when he was just a kid actually fighting as an aristocrat in the Crimean War. And then he repeated his worries in the novel War and Peace. But then something big happened. Tolstoy converted to his own very personal form of Christianity. He became a pacifist and a vegetarian. And the worries he'd had all along about prettifying war, making it more civilized, using law to do so, in his later life, he expressed those worries really vividly. And so I start with Tolstoy because from the beginning of the idea of making war humane, there's a critic. And Tolstoy basically says, if we make war more humane, we won't end it. Instead, we'll bake it into our lives, and we'll even pretend it's a good thing. And so I look in detail at the way he worried about the reality we've only begun to live through in our time.
Right. And I mean, it is pretty remarkable that he went through this conversion. I think you said he was at the Caesar Sevastopol, so he had seen the amputation rooms and all the brutality. Right. And so he's well known for War and Peace, but he was also involved in correspondence with other pacifists and also writing books that promoted pacifism, correct?
Absolutely. So, he was a great novelist, but he was really one of the most famous men in general of the later 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was because of his nonfiction writings as a kind of prophet or sage that he might have exercised his biggest effect. Mohandas Gandhi read Tolstoy's book, The Kingdom of God is Within Us. And really our whole understanding of nonviolent resistance of the kind that Gandhi made famous comes from Tolstoy. Martin Luther King, another great disciple, in this case American, and true to type, King in the midst of the Vietnam War argued against the war, not against just its brutality. And my point is, we've entered an age in our history where we've kind of forgotten their message, and we tend to say, oh no, the problem with the war on terror is the torture, or the problem with the drones is that too many civilians are dying. Whereas Tolstoy was asking really basic questions about whether it's moral to do this at all in any form.
Right. And I mean, they kind of tied it. It was interesting for me to read that they kind of tied it to slavery and saw that war was, or these conflicts, bloody wars, were also something that they thought would never really be overcome, that it would just be part, it was just part of the human condition. And I think that Tolstoy really had this, like you said, this kind of idea of non-resistance was, I think they got excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church.
He was. I mean, his idea comes from the Sermon on the Mount, resist not evil. And he interpreted it in a way that was more radical than many Christians in history. By the way, he drew in those interpretations on a lot of radical Americans, including some pacifists we could talk about. But Tolstoy really did try to come up with some arguments for skeptics in favor of his view that we care more about whether we start and keep fighting war and less about whether we make it more humane. So he looks back, as you say, to slavery. For millennia, everyone accepted slavery, and then suddenly it became wrong in the later 18th and early 19th century, so about 50 years before Tolstoy is writing. And he says, well, what if that's what should happen to war too? All the reformers for a long time looked at slavery and said, we can't end it, so we have to make it kinder and gentler. And all the rules around slavery before the Civil War about how you can't mistreat your slaves, rather than whether it's wrong to actually own other people. And Tolstoy said, what if we're in the same situation, just with a little delay, because we can imagine less war or no war. And maybe we should focus less on making war kinder and gentler, reducing suffering, and more on whether we have it at all. What if we give up too quick, just as we did with slavery for so long? And the same thing could be happening with war now. I think it is.
I think you're right. And I think that it's interesting because he kind of had a personal, he was an aristocrat in Russia, but he had a personal, involvement in their kind of slave or serf system. So he went through his own changes with his own serfs. And then it was interesting, too, how influential he was in the U.S. Can you talk about some of the people he influenced? I didn't know that there were Tolstoy communes, even up until Vietnam War.
Sure. Or beyond. So absolutely. He was an aristocrat account. He had a vast tract of land. You can still visit it. and he, when he developed these views, he began to try to live them out. So even before the Russian, Tsar, their king, freed the serfs in 1862, Tolstoy had tried to free his own on his land, and they kind of wouldn't accept it. Similarly, when he converted to vegetarianism, he tried to get his wife and children to stop eating meat. At first, they wouldn't buy it, but eventually they put up with it, and they became some of the most famous vegetarians because his wife put out a cookbook of vegetarian recipes that really was kind of at the center of early vegetarianism. So Tolstoy was influential as a Christian, as a kind of, a prophet on lots of different kinds of issues, and not just on war, although he did try, as you said, to drum up support across Europe for soldiers refusing to fight. And so he's a pivotal figure in the popularity of conscientious objection. But because of his commitment to peace, he did have a big impact on American figures. And so if we look at the American peace movement, which gets very big in the later 19th and early 20th century, a lot of it is emerging in response to Tolstoy. And in a way, some of the worries about Tolstoy are that maybe he goes too far. If you believe the Christianity, you really not only can't go to war, you can't kill a fly, you can't swat a mosquito. And what about self-defense when someone attacks us? So the mainstream peace movement that comes out of the United States and the United Kingdom, they generally are less radical, and they're trying to get states to get along and sign treaties with one another. And one of the big campaigns in American history, including at the very top, presidents, vice presidents, was to try to engineer as many peace treaties as diplomats could arrange, in hopes of at least getting two countries to agree never to fight again. There was no United Nations yet. So, but American leaders took Tolstoy seriously enough to pursue his agenda diplomatically.
Right. So he has this cross influence. I guess the guy's name is Aden Ballou, who Tolstoy really admired.
Right. So he's the pacifist in Hopewell, Massachusetts, which you can visit. I drove up there since I'm nearby when I was researching this. He's less famous than William Lloyd Garrison, but both of them in the 1830s kind of developed these radical Christian opposition to both slavery and war. And the trouble was that these kinds of figures in the 1850s and 60s had to choose between those two causes. What if we have to go to war to end slavery? So Garrison chose to bracket his pacifism in order to support the Civil War. But Ballou, who founded this commune out in Hopewell, made the reverse choice. And he said it's wrong even to fight the Civil War, even if it might end slavery.
Right. So, so they were corresponding. He's corresponding with Tolstoy. And also Tolstoy had an influence upon William Jennings Bryan, who was an important figure right there at the turn of the century.
Absolutely. There are so many American Tolstoy nuts, Jane Addams, William Jennings Bryan, and who became, Woodrow Wilson's vice president. And it was in that capacity that he negotiated a lot of these peace treaties before the United States, fatefully intervened in World War I in 1916-17. So what I try to get at through reminding us of that history is that while America was constantly fighting wars in Latin America, and it was starting an empire in the Philippines, there were also a lot of other tendencies, and there was no America kind of ruling the world yet, because so many people, sometimes Christians, either on their own or taking Tolstoy seriously, didn't think it was right to have such a belligerent world. And so that's part of our history that I try to recover in our time when we fight endless wars almost without a second thought.
Right. I mean, I think the U.S. has been at war now. It's for most of its history, I think only 20 years of peace in the total 250 years of our country. So it is interesting. And who is von Sutner, and why is she important in the story of pacifism?
So, what I do after looking at Tolstoy is I go on to look at the more mainstream peace movement. And I just am trying to look at just the range of icons back in the day, all the early winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, who were some of the most famous people in the world at the time because they really called for states to give up their rights to just go to war whenever they wanted. And I think the most famous and most interesting is another noble, this one, an Austrian noblewoman named Berta von Sutner. She was born in what's today Czechoslovakia, was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And she writes a novel called Lay Down Your Arms that just kind of turned the world on its ear. And it really mainstreamed the anti-war cause more than any document. Tolstoy wrote her actually and said, "You're like the new Harriet Beecher Stowe. What Harriet Beecher Stowe did for slavery, you're doing for war." And it's true that her novel, though it's practically unreadable today, I mean, I read it, had a huge effect, a bestseller that across the Atlantic sparked an enormous amount of interest in ending war. And we can sort of see why, women like von Sutner are becoming more powerful. Society is becoming more commercial. War kind of seems like something that ought to be part of the benighted past and not something that keeps going, especially when, there are more and more wars after 1850. First, there was the Crimean War. Then there were the wars of Italian and German unification, like the Franco-Prussian War, incredibly brutal. And a lot of women especially begin to say, we're empowered, we're on the road to getting the vote. Why are we allowing states to be organized so that our husbands, brothers, and sons die in such great numbers? And so women really pick up Tolstoy's crusade, and we owe them a lot, I think, along with other activists, for mainstreaming the anti-war cause through the middle of the 20th century.
Right. And I think there's an interesting quote in your book where I can't remember the woman's name, but she said the solution to war is going to be solved by females. We have to step forward and really take the point. And that's von Sutner, really, as a female. I mean, you said she sold 1 million copies around the world at that time. That's really a substantial.
That's incredible.
Yeah, really a lot. And in the book, it's fiction, but she includes those battles. Your top Battle of Magenta, Battle of Solferino, and I think those battles were really important for also this kind of humaneness influence in war, because out of that battle, what came out of that Battle of Solferino?
Right. So in 1901, the Nobel prizes begin to be issued. This chemical magnet, explosives magnet, Alfred Nobel had given money, and they choose a pacifist for the first one, and Sutner herself won it 4 years later. But they also choose another character named Henri Dunant, who was Swiss, and he was the person who in the 1860s had really first imagined humane war. So there's what I try to show in the book is that there was this big dispute in the 19th century about whether we end war or we make it more humane. Tolstoy was not confused about this dilemma. He said, actually, making it more humane could make war harder to end. But other pacifists weren't sure whether both parts of the agenda were good. The Nobel Prize kind of adopted both parts of the agenda by dividing the first one between a pacifist and Dunant. And, Sutner, when she heard that Dunant, who was an old man by this point, was being given the first Nobel, she flew into action because she didn't want the Peace Prize to get mixed up with the project of just making war less cruel. By protecting prisoners of war and things like that. So she goes out and finds Dunant and says, you need to come on board with my anti-war movement and explain that you're against war, not just brutality in war. And he does it. He says, I hate war. Now, when he'd come up with the idea of making war more humane in the 1860s, it was because he thought war would never end. The best we could do is to make it less brutal, as so many people think today when they hear about torture at Abu Ghraib or civilian casualties under the drones. But when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, Sutner convinced him that he'd been wrong and that we need to have a higher aim, which is to constrain war, try to keep it from breaking out and stop it when it starts.
Right. So, yeah. And so Sutner, who was the one who started the Geneva Conventions and the Red Cross? Did that come out?
That's Dunant. So I should have mentioned that in the 1860s, when he has the idea of making war humane, he says, let me do something about this. So he gets together with these other Swiss gentlemen and they create a treaty. They summon all the European powers to Geneva, and they write the first Geneva Convention, which basically says you have to let private citizens minister to wounded soldiers on the battlefield when the generals forget them. Because Dunant had wandered across this battlefield of Solferino on a business trip, and these young men are just bleeding out and left to die by their armies. And so he says, let's not let that happen again. And from that seed, everything we now think should never happen in war, like the abuse of POWs or excess harm to civilians, comes. And we have new Geneva Conventions notably in 1949, which are still good law. So it's really interesting that Dunant founds the Red Cross, which even to this day supervises the laws of war. But those laws aren't about keeping wars from happening. They're about making them less brutal when they happen.
Right. So more humane. And also, I found it interesting. Piece of history I didn't know was Tsar Nicholas II's attempt to forestall war and calling for a peace conference that involved von Sutner as well. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So after the 1860s and the first Geneva Convention, as I mentioned, there's this big debate about whether to have more peace or more humane war. And, we still don't know why, but the Tsar kind of shocks everyone in 1899 by saying, we need a general peace conference. People think that it was because he read a few books on the subject. Others say, look, he was falling behind in the arms race that the European powers were conducting. Remember that, England and Germany were in the midst of building dreadnoughts, and Russia couldn't keep up with the militarization of the European continent that led to World War I. So maybe that's why he called a peace conference. At any rate, everyone came to The Hague in 1899, but they failed, and Sutner was outraged because she said, you can't call a peace conference and fail. And yet what the diplomats did is try to save face by responding to this failure by saying, we came up with something else instead. It's almost as good. It's new rules for war, for fighting. And those are, again, part of the law of war we have today. They're called the Hague Regulations. And yet Sutner wasn't buying it. She said, this is a consolation prize. You were supposed to give us peace, and instead you've just agreed to fight less brutally. And she didn't accept it. And indeed, down through World War I, and especially in between World War I and II, activists like her repudiated just aiming for making war more humane, because they said we've got to pressure states to give up fighting with each other, or at least some of the time.
Right. And so, I mean, there were other attempts. I think you talk about these binding arbitrations that were supposedly supposed to forestall wars, but they didn't really working as World War I started. I mean, I think Sutner passed away in 1914, you mentioned, right before the Archduke Ferdinand was murdered. And that really set off this very inhumane, probably the most brutal war up until that time. Can you talk about what led to that and what the consequences of World War I were?
Sure. So, as William Jennings Bryan is negotiating treaties, they're arbitration treaties. The idea was basically, before we just start firing shots, let's try to see if we can have someone negotiate an alternative. And for a long time, before there was a United Nations, the idea was to get together some kind of arbitration scheme that would basically give the dispute between states to a third party judge who would, decide the right and wrongs. And that way there wouldn't have to be a war. Well, states never accepted, that kind of constraint. They allowed for voluntary arbitration, but never kind of mandatory. And of course, when World War I came, it's kind of shocking that people thought that peace could ever have another chance. I mean, there'd been all these activists like Sutner who'd, clamored for peace for a generation, and all we got was, a terrible war. But as you say, World War I was so cruel that afterwards people said, well, we can't make war less brutal either. So we have to stick with the attempt to get rid of war, or at least as many wars as we can. So they found the League of Nations. There's a Kellogg-Briand Pact that actually outlaws war, and the United States signs and ratifies it. And so for a generation there, in between World War I and the rise of Adolf Hitler, there's like a good faith attempt to kind of pick up the pieces of Sutner's dream and try to make it a reality. It's just that they don't succeed. And yet in the streets, especially in America, there's such distaste for World War I that there really is a big kind of peace commitment in between World War I and II. And it's probably the furthest that peace ever got in American history, because World War I was so unpopular until Adolf Hitler made it clear that it was going to be necessary to redo,
right, and go the second time. And you kind of go into, in your book, this element of air war, and I think that it adds over to our present time, how
Yep.
these bombings and the effects upon civilians, even to the present, and the drone things. Can you talk about what happened in World War II in that regard?
Absolutely. So maybe we should begin just for a second by going back, because we've been talking about making war humane, and we've been talking about ending war. Most of those causes were about white people protecting whites from other whites. So it's really about a transatlantic campaign. Meanwhile, most states, especially the European empires, as well as the United States and places like the Philippines, where we fight a very brutal counterinsurgency, we don't think the same, problems of war and brutal war are really kind of applying to when whites fight non-whites, really around the world. And the history of air war and its rise kind of illustrates that before the bombing of Germany in the midst of World War II, right when the airplane's invented, people begin to get scared. There are very few sorties in World War I where there's civilian bombing involved. It's not that big a deal, but people begin to say, the future of war is in the air and from the air. And of course, it is through our own day with drones. And so there's a lot of fear. Sutner, to her credit, thinks it's terrible that all these European empires are bombing routinely in their colonies against non-whites, and says it's not good enough to get angry about this when it happens to us. We need to nip this in the bud. And she writes a whole tract against bombing from the air, but she's ignored. And the rise of air forces, makes it practically guaranteed that World War II will be decided in large part by indiscriminate violence from the air. And we know that happened with the Americans and Brits bombing Germany after, the terrible things that Germany did during the Blitz, its own bombing. And then, of course, America bombs Japan, first firebombing and then the nuclear devastation. And, the interesting thing from this point of view is that this is supposed to be a war for a final peace. Right. And in a way it gets provided. What Sutner wanted, a transatlantic peace, is provided by America stepping up in a way it didn't after World War I. But America also shoulders the responsibility of fighting the world over after World War II. And just as it did in Japan, it begins to bomb very routinely. And those are brutal practices, right or wrong, bombing Japan, bombing Korea, bombing Vietnam.
Cambodia, right, all those.
Absolutely, are become like an American way of life. And so if you like, America gives peace to Europe, but kind of takes on the brutal wars that Europeans had been fighting worldwide and that it fought in the Philippines, in its own empire. So it's, 1945 is this very fateful moment. We get a kind of peace in one place. We get brutal war everywhere else. And the point of my book is to say something big happened after that, because even though we still have air war, we care a lot about brutality in ways that our American ancestors didn't.
Yeah, and I mean, after 45, there just was so much indiscriminate bombing, and I think it leads up to this kind of drone element. You end up your book talking about the death of Soleimani in 2000, and also the intro to your book was I love the juxtaposition you had between the wedding party in New Canaan, Connecticut, and then the wedding party in Kandahar, and how this kind of juxtaposition of the U.S. and Afghanistan, very timely, and their perception of this kind of new technological cyber warfare, special forces warfare. It's really was fascinating.
Right. So, the story I tell is that in part because we begin to kind of care about the toll of civilian bombing that we've done indiscriminately over Japan, Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, and so forth. But also because the laws that Tolstoy worried about began to be taken seriously after Vietnam. We changed air war, and we in part it was because we had new technological possibilities like drones or teched up special forces, which we send almost everywhere in the world these days. But it seems different to me, because when we talk about bombing civilians around the world, we say, well, what if too many died? When Soleimani was killed, the lawyers were involved to make sure that only combatants and not civilians died. When under Donald Trump, he struck and special forces got the leader of the Islamic State. The guys land. Their first act is to segregate the women and children and kill as few of them as possible when they shoot dead our adversary. And so that wouldn't have happened in World War II, when we just indiscriminately bombed civilians, or even in Korea, which was maybe the worst, war in terms of brutality that America's fought on both sides, and then Vietnam. So, we could get into this, but something big happens, I think, in terms of embarrassment, in terms of optics, in terms of public relations after Vietnam, when the military itself says, we can't do this anymore, and the public demands a new kind of war.
Yeah, no, something really did change. And it's the same thing happened in Iraq with some of the leaked videos that came out of strikes by missiles from the sky, civilians being killed. And it really has reinvented this modern kind of warfare that keeps all of those things into account, but tries to maintain that humaneness, but maybe doesn't live up to that, I would say. We're kind of coming to the end here. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I'd missed before we wrap it up?
I'll just say that, you're totally right that, I think spring 2004, when the Abu Ghraib photos were revealed, was kind of the big break. We'd invaded Iraq, and it was brutal and violent, very, very, lots of troops on both sides, lots of violence. But when the Abu Ghraib photos were revealed, I think there was like a moment when people said, we have to wage this war on terror more humanely. And it has had a big effect, especially once Barack Obama took office, because, as I try to show in the last chapter, he really struggled to make the war on terror more humane, getting out of places like Afghanistan, but also allowing us to kind of keep fighting if we could be precise and humane along the way. And that's the future I think Americans are facing. And the question is, do they want it?
Right. That's a good question. That's the way it's going to work out. Are we going to have these drone strikes, drone wars far from the sky that continue forever? I don't know. Anyway, the title of the book, and a very excellent conversation. Thank you so much, Samuel Moyn. Title of the book that comes out September 7th, 2021 is Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right, cool.